The world watched with bated breath as the anniversary of Victory in Europe Day approached. Russian President Vladimir Putin, seeking to control the narrative of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, proposed a 72-hour ceasefire. This gesture, seemingly aimed at honoring the shared history of the Soviet Union and its allies in World War II, was met with skepticism and outright rejection. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, unconvinced of Putin's sincerity, dismissed the proposal. He saw it as a ploy, a tactical maneuver designed to provide respite for Russian forces entrenched in Ukrainian territory. Zelensky's refusal to accept the ceasefire was not merely a rejection of Putin's offer. It was a bold declaration of Ukraine's determination to continue its resistance. It signaled that Ukraine would not be swayed by symbolic gestures, particularly those offered by an adversary actively engaged in military aggression against its sovereignty. The world took note of Zelensky's resolute stance, a stance that underscored the depth of the rupture between the two former Soviet republics. The international community, deeply invested in finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict, found itself at a crossroads. Putin's ceasefire proposal, while viewed with suspicion by many, had presented a glimmer of hope for a pause in the hostilities. Zelensky's rejection of the offer, while understandable given the circumstances, dashed those hopes and raised fears of a protracted and even more brutal conflict. The world braced itself for the continuation of the war, the end seemingly nowhere in sight. The ramifications of Zelensky's decision were felt far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The conflict had already destabilized the region, sending shockwaves through global energy markets and triggering a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. The failure to reach even a temporary ceasefire signaled a deepening of the crisis, with potentially devastating consequences for all involved. As the date for Victory Day celebrations in Moscow approached, Zelensky made another move that reverberated on the international stage. He issued a stark warning to world leaders, particularly those considering attending the commemorative events in the Russian capital. His message was clear: attending the celebrations would be tantamount to endorsing Putin's actions in Ukraine. Zelensky's warning was not a veiled threat. It was a direct challenge to the international community. He questioned the judgment of any leader who would stand alongside Putin while Russian forces continued their assault on Ukrainian soil. The message was particularly pointed at leaders of African nations, some of whom had maintained a neutral stance on the conflict, or even expressed a degree of sympathy for Russia's position. The warning sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, forcing leaders around the world to reassess their planned attendance at the Moscow celebrations. Some, heeding Zelensky's warning, quietly withdrew from the event, citing scheduling conflicts or other diplomatic engagements. Others, undeterred or unwilling to snub Putin, maintained their plans to attend, their presence in Moscow seen as a tacit acknowledgement of Russia's narrative of the conflict. Zelensky's warning highlighted the complex web of alliances and rivalries that had come to define the international response to the war in Ukraine. It exposed the fault lines in the global order as nations grappled with the implications of taking sides in a conflict that had no easy answers. Zelensky's warning to world leaders, particularly his pointed message to African nations, elicited a mixed response across the African continent. Some African leaders, already wary of what they perceived as Western hypocrisy and its condemnation of Russia's actions, saw Zelensky's warning as an attempt to dictate their foreign policy decisions. They bristled at the suggestion that they were being pressured to take sides in a conflict that, while devastating, was primarily a European affair. Others expressed concern over the escalating rhetoric and the potential for the conflict to spill over into a wider global confrontation. They urged all parties to exercise restraint and to prioritize dialogue and diplomacy over military escalation. The African Union, in a carefully worded statement, called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, emphasizing the need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. The varied reactions to Zelensky's warning underscored the diversity of perspectives within Africa regarding the conflict in Ukraine. While some African nations shared the West's condemnation of Russia's actions, others were more nuanced in their stance, recognizing the historical ties between Russia and many African countries, particularly those that had gained independence during the Cold War era. The conflict in Ukraine presented a diplomatic dilemma for many African nations. They were torn between their desire to maintain good relations with both the West and Russia, while also upholding the principles of non-interference and respect for international law. The war in Ukraine had inadvertently thrust the spotlight onto Ukraine's own involvement in conflicts beyond its borders. Of particular concern were Ukraine's alleged ties to armed groups operating in the Sahel region of Africa. These allegations, vehemently denied by Kyiv, had nonetheless strained relations between Ukraine and several African nations, most notably Mali and Niger. Mali, grappling with a complex insurgency in its northern regions, accused Ukraine of providing support to separatist rebels who had launched deadly attacks against Malian soldiers and Russian mercenaries operating in the country. These accusations led to a diplomatic rupture between Bamako and Kyiv, with Mali severing diplomatic ties with Ukraine in August 2024. Niger, in a show of solidarity with its neighbor, followed suit, further isolating Ukraine on the African continent. The diplomatic fallout from the Sahel accusations further complicated Ukraine's efforts to garner support from African nations in its struggle against Russia. The accusations, whether true or fabricated, played into existing narratives within Africa about Western hypocrisy and double standards, particularly when it came to issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine's efforts to counter these narratives and repair its image in Africa were hampered by the ongoing conflict with Russia. The war in Ukraine consumed Kyiv's diplomatic bandwidth, leaving it with limited resources to engage with African nations on their own terms and address